pastor preached about the devastation after the tsunami hit Southeast Asia. I'd been seeing the images all week on TV and couldn't sleep. The pastor's final words to do something echoed in my mind night after night as the faces and the pictures woke me up. Praying didn't seem like enough. I didn't have any money to give. I don't know why it affected me so much, but it did. I couldn't even eat. Finally, I told my parents I was going. They tried to talk me out of it, but I wouldn't listen. I quit school. I sold some stuff. I got a plane ticket. I had to go. I just had to go. Now, I do have responses from over 30,000 listeners collected over 10 years. And everything else that I'll share with you today came from that research. However, this particular statement came from a young woman I know who was in my classroom describing the transformative power of the spoken word. And she used this as example. Her classmates at my state university were in awe. When she was done sharing this, was quiet, and then a hand went up. What did you do when you got there? Her response, I held the babies. I know her, so that one gets to me. So I have shared that story other times, and once when I was sharing it, I saw a pastor. He was obviously a pastor. I won't make any judgments. But I saw a pastor in the back, and he was glaring. He was. And he came up afterwards, and his church wasn't far away from me, I discovered. And he said, I'd like to see you. I have 15 minutes on Tuesday. If you'll arrive by 1:35, that'd be appropriate. All right, that's great. So when I entered his office at precisely 1:35, I saw this man. Let's call him Pastor John. Pastor John. He had a stress ball in each hand. Seriously, two. There were more on the desk, and I don't know how he imagined he could handle more than two. But the man was stressed. And he said to me, this story you told, I can't aim for that. It would take more preparation time. Don't you understand? I almost heard him say, don't you understand, woman? You know, don't you understand? I don't have more time. And he was right. He didn't have more time. And through the course of this research and the relationships that were established as I was involved in it, I learned indeed that pastors are very pressed for time. And the research results indicate that changing preparation habits, not adding time, but changing preparation habits shows up in measurable life response by the listeners. That's how we measured preaching efficacy, preaching excellence. Do the listeners change? It's a good goal. In fact, in a study in the early 2000s, late 90s, 100 churches, representative sample nationwide, we found that in all types of churches, both the clergy and the listeners say that preaching is about change. Why do I preach? Clergy response, I want there to be growth, spiritual growth. I want there to be change. Why do I listen? Listener response, I want there to be spiritual growth. I want there to be change. We have agreement, and yet we have a challenge. We do have a challenge. And how preachers prepare affects the degree to which their listeners change. That's good news. That's good news. Because if you're convinced that preaching, the word spoken, can be transformative to individuals, to congregations, to communities, to culture. I'm with you. I'm with you. And if you don't believe it, let's have that chat afterwards. That's a whole other workshop, and I love to talk about the transformative power of the spoken word. But if you believe it, you may begin to need your stress ball. How can I do things differently? My intention is pure. Yes? That's one of the things I was convinced of throughout this research and all my relationships with preachers, that the intention to make a difference, the intention to speak for God, what a task. The intention was so positive. And yet, and I report this sadly, but with solutions, listener-reported change as a result of sermons, of sermon communication, is rare. It is rare. And so in the initial study, that figure was in 5% of sermon communication interactions, change is measurable, as reported by the listener. Now, if we could mount a video camera on the shoulder and maybe one internally to see the workings of the heart and leave it there over decades, perhaps we'd get a better number. But we do know that in the majority of instances, as millions listen in this country alone, and hundreds of thousands speak, that the results are something like this. Preacher, let me tell you about something. Listener response, I agree with you. And then we do it again. And I know from relationship with clergy and being a listener, and I know from the original research that had not been the goal. The goal had been change. Spiritual growth, biblically founded. Change, transformation had been the goal. So this research, I'll tell you about it very briefly, and then we're going to get right to the preparation habits that make a difference. So, with a Lilly-endowed project called the Center for Excellence in Congregational Leadership, held at the gorgeous Green Lake Conference Center in Wisconsin, we had pastors in cohorts for 2.5 years who engaged in lots of leadership activities. And when I'd originally heard about this work, those leadership activities, that professional growth for clergy, had not included preaching. And so I threw a little fit, just a little one. This is the opportunity of the week, preaching. The opportunity for leadership. In fact, the listeners will tell us this is where I look first, and sometimes only. I know you don't like that, but this is where I look first, to the preaching, for any catalyst of my spiritual growth. Preaching is leadership. So after I threw my little fit, I got assigned to implement that component of the program. You know how that goes. And pleasantly, we had the Lilly support and also the support of the University of Wisconsin system, as throughout this period I was granted a couple of sabbaticals and some other grant funding, so we were able to make this happen with a wonderful team of consultants, including psychologists and theologians, and of course I was the communication person, the one who studies the spoken word, what it means to our being human, and how it brings about change. The pastors in the preaching component participated in gathering responses from listeners before they came, and I summarized those. They also sent me videos of their sermons. I gave them feedback about those, And then in consultation, and as they watched their own sermons and heard the feedback, they worked with colleagues now well known and determined a strength. Often the lists were long, but the process to the strengths was very difficult. They determined a strength, and from that strength, they set a goal. One concrete thing they would do, that they would change about their preaching. And then later, we measured again with videotape, with listener response, with focus groups of listeners, with journaling from listeners. We listened again and assessed again and did that over time. That's the nature of the research. And when you hear that description, you can understand that we didn't say, change these 4 things about your preparation and let's see what happens, and then measure it. It was a much more organic process, so that the preacher, through a process of consultation, self-discovery, growing self-awareness, prayer, reflection, colleague conversation, came to a conclusion about a strength, and from that strength, made an action. Now here's the really great news. All the actions that made a measurable difference, and for me, as an academic, that means statistically significant, right? So that made a measurable difference. The big 4 had to do with preparation. What do you do in that preparation? So we have the preparation and the spirit at work in that work. And we have response and the spirit at work in that work. And in the middle, we commune. That root word of communication. Sermon communication. An oral process in which meaning is made. Are you wondering if your preaching is transformative? Have you experienced, this is a head nod question, we will get to talk. Have you experienced, as a listener, transformative spoken words? Maybe interpersonal is easier to find, but you can recall life-changing, life-giving, community-altering, culture-shaking, global implication spoken words. That's good. That's good. Now, if this 95% of sermons being preached are not accomplishing that possible goal, why not? What are the barriers? Now, I have some handouts here, and this is fun for me. I was supposed to do this workshop last year. I don't know how many of you were signed up for last year. And I was a no-show because my husband had a pancreas transplant. Now, I think that's the best excuse I've ever heard. And so I crafted my handouts, let's say some time ago. And I think there's much that is useful here, but the page I'd like you to get yourself to is this one. It's the barriers, and I want you to brainstorm barriers that keep, perhaps you're preaching, perhaps not, but keep preaching in general from bringing about the transformation which is possible when the gospel is spoken. Let's do it. Find the diagram and start to chat, please. Here is this potential of the word spoken. Here we have Julie's response. She held the babies. why not? Always. This can be a two-person activity. If you haven't met the person next to you, they do have a name tag. Let them know your role. And then begin to brainstorm. Again, this is not why you're preaching. We're going to assume your preaching is transformational. But why any preaching anywhere might not be transformational. I believe by the volume that there are barriers. And I wonder if we could just call out a few of them in no more than 6 words. What are some of the barriers? Maybe you have just one word.
Attention span?
Attention span.
Lack of credibility.
Lack of credibility.
We're doing oral communication in a visual age.
Oral communication in a visual age. Has the spoken word, have any spoken words changed anything for you lately?
Yes.
All right, we're going to go on from there, but I have a lot to say about that comment. But we're going to keep going.
We want
Yes.
people to stay.
We want people to stay. Hence,
If I
Yes.
preach change, it might go off.
yes, and more than 90% of the sermons studied pre-professional development, pre-action plan based on strength, did not ask for change. Did not ask for change. They were informative, not transformative. In purpose, in structure, in style. Though it was the prayer of that pastor's heart that change would happen. And the listeners came in hopeful that there could be growth. No change was asked. Great fear of manipulation or appearing to be anything like that. Other barriers. Yes?
My energy level?
Your energy level, that's right. Not even enough energy to squeeze those stress balls anymore that we were talking about. We have some burnout, yes.
So not relevant to the audience.
Say that one more time.
Non-relevant.
Non-relevance, yes. And I have been cautioned by many clergy not to use the word relevance. And yet you used it, and I am only repeating what you said. Yes. Pandering, least common denominator. Yeah.
I want to ask you, are we talking about barriers about preaching for those people who we know and we really expect to meet every Sunday, or with people we dream to know every Sunday?
Well, perhaps you've just identified a barrier. Who are your listeners, and why are they present? The question is, what are the barriers to the word preached bringing about transformation at all the levels?
Because I think somebody said here that I will lose those people, they will leave if I change my preaching.
Yes, and I will tell
am I
you,
preaching to
yes.
to keep them in front of me, listening to me every Sunday, or I'm preaching to that's a question I really face as a person.
So what if they leave? Yes.
My comment was, when someone joins a church, we want them, expect them to stay from 16 to 66. But if we're preaching change, then we should expect that they leave and move on into ministry or something radical like that. Church, the only thing, seminary, they expect you to leave here and do something. Church, we expect they stay there and do nothing.
Again, I'm listening. And I want the record to show that I didn't say that. But that fear of a negative response is a barrier. And yet I can say to you from the listeners' compilation of their responses, they want to be challenged. They do not wish to be reminded of what they already know. Now, sometimes that can be fortifying, sustaining. But regularly, as listeners seek growth, that challenge is what they long for. There are barriers, and you may have more on your list. Preparation time and a lack of information about listener response are among those barriers. We also talked over here about teaching versus preaching. Can we just stay all afternoon? Really, do we have only 31 minutes to go? Yes, that's correct. So I'm going to focus us on these results. And in part, the reason I selected that focus is because there is so much hope in them. These are doable. I didn't say they were easy. They're not the 4 little changes I can make, my little tweak of preparation so that I can change the world. I do have several quotes from preachers who said they entered their profession expecting to be world changers and are now embarrassed that they had such aspirations. Many comments like that, and yet many rejuvenated. Remember the research process now. These were changes they selected after reflective practice and changes that made a difference in the listener's response. All right. This is my favorite one, the first one. Well, right now while I'm talking about it, it's my favorite. There's another favorite. But I had to publish this in Communication Education, which is a journal with a very high rejection rate. And while I had set my expectation at 0.05% and 30 statisticians in the room, this one, which I couldn't report it that way, but came out at 0.01. So, I mean, this one it's firm, all right? It is strong. So the preachers who made one change in their preparation that made a difference, first, that change was pursuing personal spiritual growth. Pursuing not professional, not lectionary for next week related, personal spiritual growth. And here's one of the hard things that I say to you from this work and from my vision for the radical work that God is doing in the grand narrative of redemption. And that is that if sermons are going to be deeper, if sermons are going to be deep and transformative, preacher, you're going to have to go deeper. Spiritually deeper. One of the kinds of preparation we talk about in the discipline of communication is remote preparation. Example, Jane Goodall. She's here to talk about chimpanzees. All right. I think she probably knows a thing or two. Why? Because she's lived it. This is her life, her passion. She has suffered for this passion. That depth, that remote preparation, no matter what aspect of the topic she will discuss, will feed her. The nature of these personal spiritual growth activities included the following. Mostly, and though there are 5, mostly addressing unaddressed personal or relational issues. And becoming aware of what they are, right, is necessary before they can be addressed. And it can be raw, and it can be painful, and it can take time. And God invites you to that anyway. But the little research benefit here is that it'll show up as change in your listener spiritual journeys. What is it? Let's get after it. A second pursuit from these preachers' work was adopting a new spiritual discipline. One evangelical pastor began to pray as he walked a labyrinth. It is the only change he made, and it showed up as measurable difference in the response to his preaching. A third spiritual growth activity was new avenues of service outside your professional role. You're not here as Pastor Phil or Pastor Zachary. Here to serve. This one is great. If the first one we're like, oh, not ready yet. This one, a commitment to close personal relationships. Find them, feed them, keep them. There's an accountability and grace in relationship that is authentic, that moves us deeper in our understanding of how God works and who God is. It's about relationship. I heard one of you preach about that recently. And the final one was an expansion of reading or viewing selections. So this is related to something in communication we call selective perception. That as we believe something and are committed to it and passionate about it, it is easy for us to make selections in our perception that we only read or view that which supports our already held perception. And we miss out on a whole lot of fascinating, provocative, soul-expanding, mind-expanding, heart-expanding material. Sure about something? Find someone who's written on how wrong you are. All we have to do is look at the difference in newscasts to know about that bifurcation and polarity in our political system. Same story, different story, yes. Expanding your reading or viewing selections is a spiritual growth activity coming through that lens of the place you are in your journey. So, 0.01, love that, love it. All right. What else did preachers change in their preparation? Now, I reminded you at the beginning, and some of you were late, but so I need to say this again, that the preachers in this study did not increase their preparation time. They changed what they did during their preparation time. So, some of the things they stopped doing, if you think I'm going to say studying their scripture, you're wrong. This is the foundation. They stopped doing was working on their PowerPoint slides and doing internet searches. By the way, personal spiritual growth activities, Googled this morning, 636,001 websites available for me, or for you. That was number one. All right, so pushing some things out to make room for personal spiritual growth, knowing that though it may not directly relate to an exact sermon, it will show up as change in listeners, in communities, lives, and ways of being. All right, not only what is happening inside of you, but also a change that can be made has to do with those who are listening. You want to change them? That's not what I'm about to tell you. Preachers who made a change that made a difference listened to their listeners as part of their preparation process. And we had multiple spin-off studies from that, and I'll tell you all about it in the next workshop. Workshop C is on the listening. For now, I'll tell you one story. Pastor Michael. He's self-identified as a teacher, not a preacher. He spoke for 45 minutes on a regular basis. He used the whiteboard and the markers. He had no hair, and he was cool. He decided that he would try a pre-sermon dialogue group with his listeners. I'll tell you the details. You come later, otherwise you can read about it. I'll tell you where later. And he was part of the study, so I got to be present quietly in the corner and observed this and then heard about it more from him later. He was going to be preaching a series on forgiveness. Anybody here not done that? All right. And he wanted to hear from his listeners. And so we had a facilitator. The conversation was about forgiveness. There was one woman in the group that particular time. And at the end, the facilitator noticed that she hadn't said anything. And so the facilitator said, "Do you have anything to contribute?" And she said no. Most people left the room, it was over, and then she began to weep. And she had a conversation with the facilitator that Pastor Michael and I overheard, in which she described the sexual assault by her clergy father. And she said, "I won't be coming to this series." Pastor Michael was more grieved than I think I've ever seen a man. Here's why. The thought had never occurred to him that someone in his congregation would have such a story. And not just in preparation for this series, but never in his life had it occurred to him that those statistics have faces and include church attenders. And that great grief, as you might imagine, changed him and changed his preaching, and not just for that series. The examples he had in mind to illustrate what might need to be forgiven were so trite by his own assessment that he had not planned to do what it is he could do with God's great grace and mercy. And he was the steward of that mystery, and he was grieved. Listening to the listeners during preparation, the exegesis of the congregation, the community, the global community. A third way that preachers changed that made a difference was that they began to craft their sermon communication out loud. In the first wave of this work, that preparation habit was selected by less than 1% of the clergy on a regular basis. And it is often perceived to be a polishing activity to make something sound smooth and perhaps not even real. It would be so smooth. And an argument may be made. I intend to speak from my heart or read from my carefully crafted manuscript rather than having a conversation with my listeners. And crafting orally doesn't fit with that. In fact, the average preparation time is between 12 and 13 hours. That doesn't include, living with the text while you're showering or whatever, but actual, documented preparation is between 12 and 13 hours for clergy. And if you did a pie chart on what's happening in those 12 or 13 hours, being alone and writing take up more than half of those hours. And yet, the thing for which you're preparing is with other people and it's out loud. I just want to make that. I should remember that. All right, so other people and out loud. So when the preparation process acknowledges that spoken nature of the activity and the listening element, that is, if you need to make sanctification clear and lively, explain it to your 13-year-old. Really do it, right? Another human being, and you're talking it out loud. This practice does affect language choice, and it does affect organization. That's not what you expected me to say, but it's true, all right? So yeah, delivery is going to be better probably if you do it out loud. But along the way, as you are deselecting content, have you ever noticed you really can't say everything in the time? So if you can deselect content in preparation, not in the sermon communication itself, this is good. And crafting out loud helps you do that. Crafting out loud affects organization. And side note, first study, organization is listeners' #1 complaint. I'm processing this auditorily. Let me be able to follow you. And no, I don't need a fill-in-the-blank 4-page outline where I put in the right words. I want to be provoked, and I want to be able to track. And though you may think you're going through the passage, I just heard 17 different topics. Now, I'm putting it rather rudely. And most listeners were not that rude about it, but organization, I need to follow you. One pastor was watching his own video, and his head just went further and further down until he was just kind of like this, looking just between 2 fingers. And after it was over, I said, he gets to speak first, how was this for you to hear yourself preach? And he said, even I lost me. It makes so much sense on my written text, and I see all those ideas, but even I lost me. Transitions, the conceptual links, the start, the finish, the structures, there's so many shapes. It's so much fun to play with the shapes. And you can do that when you craft orally. Talk it out. What's happening first? What are the best words? How does the story come across? Is that really a story, or are you just alluding to an incident? How could you bring it to life? Out loud. Out loud made a difference. I'm talking statistical difference. Crafting it, getting that into an outline, and then rehearsing orally. Not after it's all over does that orality begin. And finally, And the master of this one is in the house. And he walked in late. He, a member of my consultation team, but much more as well. Author of a book called The Sermon Sucking Black Hole. I would recommend it. David Maines is here with his wife Karen. And he and I have talked with so many pastors about number 4. Have I told you number 4 yet? I haven't, no. You don't have a blank to fill in, but let me just tell you it's coming. Right? So we've already said that most of those sermons didn't ask for change, even when the pastor was praying for it and the listener was hoping for it, didn't even ask for it. I wonder what response you wanted last time you preached. It's going to be a shorter chat, but just, share it. What was your response? What response did you want? Let's go with that question. Prayerfully, exegeting the text, preparing at least 12 or 13 hours, I bet. What did you think could happen? Chat, just do 1 minute chat. Last sermon, what was going to happen? Scary.
Recruit on the vaccine.
Spirit can and will work. And yes, you cannot predict the multitude of responses. Is your goal a goal related to transformation? Do you know your goal? The preachers who began to have a preparation habit of carefully crafting a response goal for their sermon before they began to craft orally or to work on that sermon in other ways are preachers whose change in preparation showed up as spiritual growth in their listeners' lives. I love being able to say that. This is doable. As an academic, I always have student learning outcomes. Now, as a vice chancellor, I have them for the entire institution, and we measure them. We look for evidence. We look for authentic learning artifacts of the things we're going after. What are we trying to bring about? Do we know? After living with the text, after the work of exegesis, through the work of prayer, identifying a response goal, and then organizing and crafting and listening to listeners through that goal changes the result. Why do you think that might help? You're focused. Okay, so that deselection we talked about, like, oh my gosh, here in this phrase in verse 4, there's a whole thing I could do on a baptism by water. I think I'll just throw it into this sermon on loving your enemies, right? Because it's such good stuff and they don't know it and they need to know it, right? So it helps with that inner turmoil of what to include. There's a focusing. It affects organization as well. One listener comment of the thousands and thousands was, why does he do 30 minutes on how we need to love our enemies and 5 on how to do that? For the listeners, depth is in the how-to.
Yes.
That requires your depth. A scripture written for all people and all periods of history is not going to have what does it look like and who is the enemy in 2015 or 2042. This is your work in preparation. And prayerfully determining that response goal can be useful. I would call your attention to your handout. I've taken yours so you can look at it. And on page 7, I have a reflective practice challenge. Being reflective means paying attention to what you're doing while you're doing it and being systematic and disciplined in that practice. It's the way I wrote the results of this work because that's the way the pastors approached their professional development. And here we have examples of ways in which people have written sermon response goals, and there's much more about that in the book. But I would call your attention to that as one of the ways that preparation processes change. So now what are they again? What preparation processes can you change and expect that there'll be a change in your listeners' response, not just as individuals, but as a congregation, community, culture? What are those? What's the first one? I said was my favorite. Personal spiritual growth. And let's just start with A on that sub-point was, what is it? Address it, yeah, all right. And you have your other list, that's good. And then the workshop next time is on the second one, which is, yeah, you're going to listen to your listeners as preparation. Who are they? What does it mean to them to struggle with your passage or topic, as Michael's listener would have been? And then here's this novel, apparently not common practice in preparation, but you can do it. And it might shake you out of your manuscript, and we might have to talk about how to do an outline and the panic attack that you may have without that safe thing there in front of you. But what is it? What was number 3? Yeah, crafting out loud, rehearsing out loud when you get to what it is you're going to have in front of you, which should serve the relationship you have with those who listen. This manuscript, this sermon, the thing, that's not the sermon. The communication is the thing, right? So whatever's there, how it's highlighted, how it's organized, should serve as a visual cueing device so that you and I, as your listener, can be in relationship around the potential of what our great God can do. And finally, that's very concrete and practical and lots of information that David can teach you for days. We have a couple of different books that help with this, why it makes a difference, how to do it, to discipline yourself to do what now?
Transitional goal.
Yeah, right. Short, tight, like a student learning outcome. What is the goal? Of course, the Spirit is fueling your decisions about that. I want to tell you here at the end about Pastor Mike. I'll tell you, when I saw him the very first time, I'd seen him on videotape, but saw him in person. Mike was a mess. I'll give it to you in his words. He's talking about watching himself preach on videotape with his close clergy friends next to him. As the tape began to play, I realized that my appearance, my voice, my preaching were much worse than I had ever imagined. Sweating and shaking, I cringed as the public display of my inadequacies continued. I couldn't concentrate, tuning out for my appearance and voice and tuning in to the actual words. I was a mess. And in that state, I heard God speak of tremendous love for me, regardless of my accomplishments. the voice of God was my own. Through that tape, God was comforting me, speaking to me through me. And oh, the joy. For that is preaching. That is the task to which we have been called. God chooses to speak through earthen vessels, broken, fat, flawed vessels like me. This mic. As we go, I imagine I will only know you for these minutes. Maybe we will connect some other time. And I feel grateful and honored to have interacted with you. I hope there has been value from the work of all these clergy colleagues over all these years, and from the response of the listeners who are usually silent. And though I live with a theologian, I am not one, but I'm a listener. And I'm your sister. And I would like to bless you. May you, stewards of the mysteries of God, be inspired and equipped to do the wonderful work of changing preaching habits so that the word spoken may become ever more transformative, igniting hope and love and justice. Amen? Amen. Amen. You want to read more, do the reflective practices? This is the most recent one on this.
Say it again.
Preaching That Matters is the name of the book that has the practices.
It's for sale.
It is, yes.
Store table